Have you ever noticed the exact moment your words get turned into a weapon against you? You sit down with a toxic family member. You bring facts. You bring receipts. You speak calmly, rationally, expecting a fair hearing. And within minutes, everything you said has been bent, inverted, and folded neatly back into the same verdict they held before you opened your mouth. You are the problem. Here is what almost nobody understands about this moment. You are feeding a machine. The role you are trapped in was not handed to you by accident, and it will never be dissolved by explanation, because it was never built on truth in the first place. Today we take that machine apart, piece by piece. We expose why defending yourself only tightens the trap, and I am going to hand you an ancient protocol, tested by a man who ran an empire surrounded by liars, that collapses the entire scheme without you saying a single word. Because the final tactic only works if you understand the 3 layers underneath it. Let's start with the architecture, because the scapegoat is not chosen at random. In family systems theory, there is a clinical term for the person who gets labeled the problem. The identified patient. The one who is marked as broken so that the family never has to look at what is actually broken. The addiction nobody names. The marriage that died years ago. The parent whose fragile self-image cannot survive a moment of honest scrutiny. All of that collective rot needs somewhere to go, so the system selects a container. And here is the part that will reorganize how you see your entire childhood. You were chosen because you were the most perceptive. The clinical synthesis is blunt about this. Scapegoats are frequently the most empathetic, the most emotionally intelligent, the most likely to actually see the dysfunction for what it is. You were a threat to the illusion, so the illusion neutralized you first. The mechanism has a name: projective identification. The family takes its own unwanted traits, its cruelty, its instability, its shame, and it projects them onto you. Then it treats you as if those traits were yours all along. Murray Bowen mapped this decades ago and called it the family projection process. Anxiety rises between 2 people. A third person gets pulled in to absorb the tension and stabilize the system. They call it triangulation. You call it your entire life, and the whole apparatus exists to serve one goal: stability. Systemic homeostasis. Families are systems, and systems fight to maintain equilibrium, even when that equilibrium is toxic. This is not a metaphor. A study published in the Family Journal found a correlation of 0.51 between family dysfunction and scapegoat assignment. Read that number carefully. It means the role was predicted by the dysfunction of the system. The sickness of the structure simply needed a place to put its pain. Here is the detail that proves it. Clinicians observe that when the scapegoat finally heals or leaves, another family member will often suddenly develop symptoms. A new problem child appears out of nowhere because the machine needs its load-bearing component. If you leave the slot empty, the structure recruits a replacement. To them, you were just a function, and that changes everything about what happens next. Because if the role is structural, then defending yourself against it is a category error. You are trying to fix a truth problem in a system that does not run on truth, which brings us to the trap almost every scapegoat spends decades inside. The explanation. You know exactly what I mean. The message you have drafted 100 times. The perfect sequence of words that will finally make them understand. The imagined conversation where you lay everything out so clearly, so undeniably, that they have no choice but to see you. That fantasy is running on a false assumption, the assumption that the other person is operating in good faith, that they simply lack information, that if you just explain it correctly, the misunderstanding will dissolve. They already have the information, but they lack the incentive to accept it, because the entire psychological defense system of the family depends on you being wrong. To truly witness you would mean admitting they were the abusers, and that admission is structurally impossible for them. When you explain, they are simply harvesting your reaction. Their only goal is extraction. They want your reaction. The raised voice, the tears, the desperate paragraph at midnight, because every reaction becomes evidence. Every reaction confirms the story they already told everyone else, and that story arrives before you do. They call it a smear campaign, and it is why your explanations look like guilt. By the time you defend yourself, the audience has already been anchored. Their minds were preloaded with the narrative. Your defense just looks like a guilty person scrambling. There is even an acronym for the behavior they are baiting you into. JADE. Justify, argue, defend, explain. The 4 doors they leave open specifically because they want you to walk through them. And every time you do, you concede the one thing that keeps the whole game running. You concede that they have the right to judge you in the first place. By showing up to the trial and accepting the charges, you end up begging a corrupt court for an acquittal. But you can refuse to be tried at all. That refusal is a tactic nearly 2,000 years old. Marcus Aurelius ruled the Roman Empire surrounded by schemers, flatterers, and men who wanted him dead. And in his private notebook, never meant for publication, he wrote something that should be tattooed on every scapegoat's mind. That the mind, unconquered by violent passions, is a citadel. A man has no fortress more impregnable in which to find refuge. The scholar Pierre Hadot later called this the Inner Citadel. The one territory no one can invade without your permission, and the gate to that citadel is a single principle, the dichotomy of control. Some things are within your power. Most things are not. Your judgments, your responses, your character over time, those are yours. Another person's opinion of you lives entirely outside your walls. It is weather. You do not argue with a storm, so if someone is determined to see you as the villain, the Stoic move is almost offensively simple. You let them be wrong. Epictetus, a man born a slave, sharpened this into a blade. He said that if someone tells you a person has been speaking ill of you, do not defend yourself. Instead, answer that clearly he was ignorant of your other faults, or he would have mentioned those too. Feel what that does. There is no surface to push against, no handle to grab. You have removed yourself from the fight entirely, and the manipulator's hand closes on empty air. Now one honest correction, because I refuse to sell you a fantasy. The citadel is not emotional suppression. Marcus Aurelius openly grieved the deaths of his children. The fortress simply keeps another person's fiction from breaching the walls of who you actually are. You can hurt. You just stop performing the hurt for an audience that feeds on it. In the recovery world, the practical version of this has a name, the gray rock method. You become uninteresting. Short, flat, factual. You give the machine nothing to metabolize. I will be straight with you. Gray rock came out of online survivor communities, not peer-reviewed labs. It is strictly a short-term survival tool. Overuse it and you go numb. But as a tactical response to an active manipulator, it is devastatingly effective, because you have finally stopped supplying the fuel. And that is precisely when the situation gets dangerous. Here is what nobody warns you about. When you go quiet, the manipulator does not gracefully accept defeat. They escalate. Behavioral science has a precise name for this, and it is settled science, not opinion. The extinction burst. When a behavior that used to get rewarded suddenly gets nothing, the behavior spikes before it dies. Think of the vending machine that eats your money. You do not walk away calmly. You press harder. You hit it. You shake the whole thing. That violent spike right before you give up. That is the extinction burst. And the manipulator is that hand hitting the machine. The lies get louder, the provocations get wilder, and they change tactics entirely. The guilt trips escalate into open aggression, and then they deploy reinforcements. Flying monkeys. The term comes from the winged servants in The Wizard of Oz, who did the witch's dirty work. The clinician Ramani Durvasula calls it proxy abuse. The abuser stays clean, floating above the conflict, while recruited relatives and friends deliver the attacks. Some of them are knowing accomplices. Most are well-meaning dupes who genuinely believe they are helping. Either way, the pressure multiplies right when you thought you had won. And here's the trap inside the trap. This escalation proves your silence is working. The burst only happens because the fuel got cut off. You are watching the machine run out of gas, but this is the exact moment most people cave. The pressure peaks, and they think, I will just respond this once, to set the record straight. Do not, because of one more mechanism, and it is the most important one in this entire video. Intermittent reinforcement. B.F. Skinner proved that unpredictable rewards create the strongest, most persistent behavior. The slot machine effect. A slot machine that paid out every time would bore you in an hour. A slot machine that pays out randomly can empty your bank account. Now apply that. Breaking down and reacting during the burst just teaches them that the jackpot exists. You have shown them that if they pull the lever hard enough, long enough, wild enough, the reward eventually drops. You have converted yourself from a dead machine into a slot machine. and they will chase that payout for years. Consistent silence starves the behavior. Inconsistent silence supercharges it. The burst is your final exam. You hold the wall, and the erratic flailing that follows does something you could never accomplish with 1,000 explanations. It exposes them. While they escalate and rage and recruit, you go on living calmly, consistently, quietly, and the contrast tells the story your words never could. One necessary line before we close. If your situation involves physical violence or genuine danger, stillness alone is not the answer. Get professional support and a real safety plan. The Citadel protects your mind. It does not stop a fist, but if this is the war of narrative and manipulation that so many of you are living inside, then understand where the real victory sits. True victory comes from making their opinion of you mechanically irrelevant. Your character, held steady over months and years, will dismantle their story more thoroughly than any argument ever could. Because a lie is expensive, it requires constant maintenance and new fuel to survive. The truth needs nothing but time. You are not the only one living this. A 2025 poll found that 38% of American adults are currently estranged from at least one family member. You were simply assigned a role, so let them keep the fictional version of you. You keep the reality. You keep the Citadel. If this breakdown helped you see the machinery clearly, subscribe to The Forge. Then drop one line in the comments. How did you use stillness to starve a manipulator's story? The next video is already waiting on your screen. Go build the next wall.